Hello, everyone, and welcome to another one of our Avatar Bible studies. Today we are in episode 16 of Book 2, Appa's Lost Days. If you can turn to the book of Proverbs, chapter 12 and verse 10, this is one that's hopefully going to be familiar with you. As we continue through these messages, it comes up a lot. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 10, note, is a point of contrast made by King Solomon in order to emphasize what a righteous person is like. A righteous man regards the life of his animal, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. Now, during Appa's time away from Aang, there were three main interactions that he had with three different kinds of people, all of which perfectly fell in line with the point of contrast Solomon was making through this proverb. To be righteous is to be in a right relationship with God, meaning you have things in common with Him. You can have a relationship with Him. And a righteous man in this setting is shown in his regard for the lives of even animals. And those who aren't in a right relationship with God have no problem causing harm, according to the Bible. The point is that even if they're trying to be nice, it comes across as cruel. Now, again, this is far from the first point that's made in the Bible concerning contrasts. In fact, Hebrew poetry lives and breathes the argument from the lesser to the greater. And in comparison to the kind of person who is right with God and the person who isn't, what I want to do with you all today is, in today's episode, walk through the three examples we saw through contrast of who Appa interacted with, where the standard came from of who we call the good guy, and why it's so reflective of the Judeo-Christian God's heart. So starting with the first interaction, or major interaction that Appa had, regarding the Fire Nation circus and the Fire Nation boy. Who was the good guy in this interaction? Well, let's ask a question. Is God abusive? The Fire Nation circus was. The boy wasn't. God isn't. According to the Bible, Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29, Jesus speaking emphasizes this point. Take my yoke, a harness meant for beasts of burden, upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Now, abusive people, in my mind, aren't seeking to ease your burdens. They're usually one of them. But note the discretion. Does the boy have more in common with the God of the Bible or the Fire Nation circus in that regard, in their wanting to be abusive by nature? Does God disregard the needs of His creation? The Fire Nation circus did. They didn't care what Appa wanted to eat. They just gave him food because it was their obligation. The boy didn't neglect the needs of God's creation. He sought to see Him ministered to, in especially the ways he most needed. And likewise, according to the Bible, God also cares about the needs of His creation. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 26, Jesus speaking in the Sermon on the Mount says, "Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap nor gather into barns," meaning they don't have a job. "Yet your heavenly Father feeds them." Note the point. And then, through contrast, obviously, Jesus drives home the point. Are you not of more value than they? He's speaking in the context of dealing with anxiety. We worry about, where's our next meal coming from? And Jesus says, look, those birds don't have a job, and God makes sure they're taken care of. Do you think God's going to take care of you? But note the point that's included in that parenthetically. God cares about the birds that contribute nothing apart from being. So note that point as well. And a third, and I'll encourage you to read this on your own time, point in regards to the Fire Nation circus. Does God allow His creation the ability to walk away from Him? The Fire Nation didn't. That's why they had them in cages. The boy did. That's why He opened them. And of course, God did. In the book of Genesis chapter 3, we're given the account of mankind told one law. Everything else about them was perfect. They didn't need to be told right from wrong. They knew its source and definition. But what was interesting about that was God made one, and notice, made one provision for them to say no to him. He didn't eliminate competition like some obsessive yandere girlfriend. He said, here's how you have a relationship with me, and here's the door. If you don't want a relationship with me, if you don't want to follow me, then here's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If you are following me, then you have the knowledge of good, and by extension, you're separated from everything evil. In Genesis chapter 3, mankind adopted the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and as you can see today, we don't do a very good job in knowing the difference. But the point being made is just that. Does God allow us to walk away from him? No, he doesn't keep us in cages. But note as well in that point, if I'm going to make a point of contrast between the Fire Nation circus, but as a whole as well, and the boy that was attending the circus, I'd say that the boy certainly had more in common with God, and thus I would call the boy righteous. The second example would be the Kyoshi warriors compared to Azula. Who are the good girls in this interaction? Well, let's ask 3 more questions. Does God care about the well-being of animals? The Kyoshi warriors did. Azula didn't. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 24, we also see that God does. Consider the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap, which have neither storehouse nor barn, and God feeds them. Of how much more value are you, than the birds? Now, that may sound familiar because, yes, it was a repeat sermon. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapters 5 through 7, was a conversation Jesus had on a mountain with his disciples. In the Gospel of Luke chapter 12, that section of Scripture is not only repeating similar sermons, or at least similar points in sermons, little variation of course, but it was also in a different environment. And I'm just going to clue you in on something here, pastor secret. We're allowed to give the same sermon more than once. So that point being said, does God pursue healing even in people that hate or distrust him? Like Appa did with the Kyoshi warriors. Well, the Kyoshi warriors did. Azula wasn't interested in Appa's healing. Like at all. Likewise, if I'm going to describe which had more in common with the character of God, I'd turn to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 44. Jesus speaking, again, the Sermon on the Mount. But I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, or growling at you, right? For, and note this, how does Jesus apply this as an ethic? For, lost my place there. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. Note that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. So it's describing a relationship. Why? For he, the Father, makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. So Jesus' point of comparison is, if you want to act more like God, then be good to those who hate you, because God causes good things, the sun, the rain, the things we take for granted in this world, the things he created, by the way, to happen to both people who love him and those who don't. The Kyoshi warriors, likewise, did good to those who, at the moment at least, hated them, because, why? It was the right thing to do. Or at least it was the sort of thing that God would have done. Azula did something different. She served to further the cause of Appa's problems. But note, which one is the good guy? And I don't want your feelings on the matter. I want you to have an objective standard. Which one was more like God? Then finishing, does God use, and this is a tricky one, scary things to keep us from even scarier things? Of course, I'm referring to Suki waving the torch at Appa to scare him away as to keep him from Azula, an even scarier source of fire. But you wonder, well, how would that have something in common with God? Well, I encourage you to read this on your own time, but in the book of Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 25, the Apostle Paul, speaking to the church in Rome, is describing the ongoing reality of not only confidence but hope that people who have a relationship with Jesus have. And what was interesting was he described this present state, the fact that we still live in a world dominated by sin, disease, and death, as not the status quo, at least forever. And in order to clarify this transition, he specifies not just that we have a glorious body to look forward to, but that all of creation can't wait for that to happen. Now you're wondering, well, what's he waiting for? Well, here's the thing. If this world was perfect, everything was restored the way it ought to be in Eden, but our hearts were still separate from God, what need would any of us have to seek salvation from a death that would never, as far as we were concerned, naturally come? In a world where death is the norm, physical death, that is, where suffering is the natural consequence of our decisions and the way we treat each other, and where the little things that we do on a daily basis that are more self-centered than God-centered are rightly described as destroying this world. Not my quote, but still a fair point. We look at all these things and say, man, I hope that this world isn't everything that I have to exist in, because this is a bummer. We have a desire for a world that ought to be a certain way that we've never seen. Now, what does that do? Well, much like with Suki and the torch, it waves us away from settling for this life and looking more towards the next. God is willing to allow things to happen if it ultimately prevents us from something worse, that is, separation from Him, not just this world. And then finishing up Appa's interaction with the guru and his interaction with Long Feng. Now, full honesty, I am not looking forward to the study we'll be doing on episode 19, where the guru becomes the focus. Yes, I know he's a Master Yoda archetype, but his portrayal of Hinduism is not only cringe, but it is every reason why Hinduism is cringe in the first place, because like most false teachers, he talks out of both sides of his mouth constantly. That rant being over, I will at least acknowledge that there were some illustrations worthwhile in him, and thus what we're talking about. Make the comparison of who's the good guy between Long Feng and the guru. Based on what objective standard, which one was more like God? Who was the good guy? Well, does God know our hearts and minds? Long Feng didn't care to know what Appa's thoughts were on the matter. The guru seemed very interested in exercising this privilege that, according to the Bible, only God has. In Jeremiah 17 and verse 10, I, the Lord, search the heart. I test the mind, even to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his doings. It's the only one who knows our thoughts. It isn't Satan, it isn't Professor Xavier, and it isn't the guru. But note, this comparison, this trait, is something that not only Long Feng was uninterested in, was completely devoid of him. The guru, on the other hand, had something in common with God. So what would we call him? I'd say the good guy. But continuing on, does God draw us to himself to harm us? Long Feng did. The guru didn't. In fact, the guru was very respectful of Appa's safety zone, if you will. And likewise, when it comes to the way that God draws us to himself, there's plenty I could read, Romans chapter 2 and verse 4 being the most significant, but I want to throw you off a little bit and actually turn to the Old Testament in the book of Hosea. Listen to how the God of the Old Testament, remember that, a whole Bible, right? Same God, but I want you to emphasize and dispel that myth that the God of the Old Testament's wrath and the God of the New Testament is all love and peace. You need to read the book of Revelation, but here's the point. Hosea chapter 11 and verse 3, this is how God describes how he's drawing Israel back to himself. I taught Ephraim, that is the most prominent, the northern 10 tribes of Israel were composed of that one tribe, Ephraim. I taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love. And I was to them as those who take the yoke from their neck. I stooped and fed them. Now, this picture is actually very beautiful. It was the way that ancient Hebrew fathers would teach their children to walk, by taking these strips of very smooth and comfortable material, usually silk, and they would balance the kids' hands on them so that they wouldn't wobble and fall. And the father would draw the child to him by holding those cords up. And as the child would learn to walk, they would have this gentle support from the father every step of the way. Now, beautiful, adorable, all that being noted and said, but make the comparison. Which was more appropriately compared to God? The one who set a trap for him and locked him in a cage, or the one who allowed him his space and gave him the note when it was time and also when he was ready? Same thing for food as well, providing that in the passage. And the last point I'll make on this: does God solve all our problems? Or does he enable us to solve multiple problems at once? Well, Long Feng certainly created a problem for Aang, not really note in comparison there, but the guru, if he knew where this would ultimately head, that he would be captured by Long Feng, then why didn't the guru just tell him to stay in the air temple with him? Well, that's an interesting thing, because he likewise has something in common with God. I encourage you to read on your own time the account of Joseph, the second to last son of Israel and the most prominent of the 12, second to Judah. But what's interesting about Joseph's account is that this guy never seemed to catch a break. He was, first of all, given a spiritual gift by God to interpret dreams, and very significant ones that would even tie into the book of Revelation later. Also note as well that when his brothers became jealous of this, and rightly so, he was a little bit of a brat, weren't we all? Aren't we all most of the time as well, I guess, at least on the internet. But what was interesting was Joseph's brothers became so jealous of him that they lured him into a pit, dropped him in it, and then only released him, originally intending to leave him for dead, into slavery in Egypt. So this guy gets hauled away from his family. His parents are none the wiser. They think he's dead. His mom died too, by the way, in between this time period. What was really sad about this situation was when he was sold into slavery, he made the most of the situation. He became the best slave that he could possibly be, serving in the house of Pharaoh's chief executioner, Potiphar, so not the guy you want to tick off. But he got in such good graces with him that he even drew the eye of one of Potiphar's wives. And what was interesting about this woman, I won't make the illustration inapt, but terms are used to describe older women stalking younger men. And that being said, she made her advances on him. He refused, maintaining integrity, which was unheard of in Egypt, and she falsely accused him of rape. Go figure, not much has changed in the last, let's see, that would be 3,800 years. But note as well, after this, Potiphar, obviously not being a fool, but needing to maintain public example, he knew his wife well enough to know that this was what was going on, but he still had to throw Joseph into prison. Remember, chief executioner, right? He could have just had him put to death. But he puts Joseph into prison, and interestingly enough, Joseph becomes the best prisoner that he can be. Even so, gaining so much favor in the eyes of the warden that he put him in charge of the prison. He just wasn't allowed to go home at the end of the day. And what was interesting as well is in that place it exposed him to individuals that were in Pharaoh's court that were suspected of being a part of an assassination attempt, a poisoning. The butler and the baker, which one, the one who prepared the food or the one who brought the food? It turned out through Joseph's dream interpretation, by the way, that it was revealed to be the baker, but the butler was revealed innocent and restored back to Pharaoh's court. He forgets about Joseph after emphasizing, hey, tell Pharaoh I'm not in here because of anything that I've done. And he says, oh yeah, I'll remember. He forgets. Years pass until God sends Pharaoh a dream. Real fun stuff, right? And this was, of course, something directly tied into the responsibilities that he had as the king of Egypt. And so this Pharaoh is like, is there anyone in Egypt that can help me with this dream? All my yes men, soothsayers, astrologers, all this other stuff, they just make stuff up to make me feel good. What does this dream actually mean? And the butler remembers, there's a guy in prison, I remember, who can do that. And he says, bring him to me. Joseph clarifies, the God of my ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's the one who interprets your dream. What is your dream? And he describes it to him, and it turns out to be a prophecy of 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine that would ultimately, if left unaware of and unprepared for, would destroy all of Egypt. And instead, Joseph ends up making Egypt, due to the preparations he sets up for this famine, the world-ruling superpower of the time. If you remember the state of Egypt in the book of Exodus, that was Joseph's work. And what was interesting about that as well is the book begins by clarifying that. There was a pharaoh who rose up in Egypt who did not know Joseph, and that by extension showed his treatment of the Jewish people. But you wonder, how did the Jewish people end up not in the Jewish land, which would eventually be known as Israel, and instead in Egypt? Why did Moses have to free Egypt, or free the Jews from Egypt in the first place? And the answer was, God was working out multiple steps at once. Joseph, in having all of this food, and his relatives, who think he's dead, by the way, living up in Canaan, they need grain. So his brothers, not knowing that Joseph, as the second in command of the whole country now, thanks to Pharaoh approving of Joseph's plan and making him this prominent figure in their government, that he's got the Egyptian mascara and the shaving, all that other fun stuff, but they don't know it's Joseph. And Joseph puts them through a series of character tests where he ultimately ends up revealing himself to them and invites them to stay at his estate. And that's how the Israelites ended up in Egypt, serving as shepherds, because the Egyptians felt that duty was beneath them. But here's the point. When all of this was taking place, and when Joseph saw, in spite of everything that he had been through, the betrayal by his brothers, the abuse, the slavery, the false accusations, the prison time that wasn't warranted, by the way, this would make most people just want to give up on life. And yet Joseph concluded all of this. If you were to ask him, was it worth all that God put you through? Well, Joseph made this observation in Genesis 50 and verse 20. What you meant for evil, God meant for good, in order to bring about as it is this day to save many people alive. Look, all of the stuff in this world that I've dealt with, God allowed, if it was going to accomplish something that was far more worthwhile than if I had never gone through it at all. And you also need to remember as well, Joseph, despite everything that he went through, and noting he certainly had something in common with God. Wait, did he? Was there ever an instance or example where God put himself in a position where he could suffer, though he didn't have to? And as a result of that suffering, resulted in many people being brought to life. Oh yeah, we refer to it as the incarnation, Jesus of Nazareth, and the work that he has done through us through the cross, his death, and his resurrection. But noting that point as well, why did God allow Jesus to suffer? Well, first of all, allowing himself to suffer, he knew that it would accomplish something far more wonderful than if he had just stayed safe in heaven. Likewise, the guru was willing to allow Appa to experience some mistreatment by the Earth Kingdom. KGB, I guess, would be the only thing to compare them to, if it ultimately meant not only reuniting him with Aang, but allowing them all to grow as a result of the process. So note those things. Why do we call someone good? Well, objectively, based on the Bible, I compare them to God and ask, do they have something in common with him? Because God is that standard for good. In a polytheistic religion like Hinduism, you don't have a set standard. You can pick any other god you want, and they are diametrically opposed to one another, all in their thousands. But if we're all to understand this as well, I want you all to emphasize and understand that point. When we look at people, like the Fire Nation circus and the boy, When we look at people like the Kyoshi warriors and Azula, when we look at people like the Guru and Long Feng, we call one good and the other not because we're comparing their character to someone. Given the citations provided here today, I think that person quite appropriately would be Jesus Christ, would be the God of the Bible. And if you want to know more about how this applies not only to the world around you, but to yourself as well, feel free to ask in the comments below. If you'd like to encourage the ministry, you know where to go. But what's most important is if you know someone who maybe has reduced good and evil to their feelings about a certain matter rather than an objective standard, would know Avatar, but perhaps not meta-ethics, please share this study with anyone you feel would be blessed by it. Thank you for your time. Remember that Jesus loves you and that we call that a good thing as well because, well, he did it. He does it. That's who he is by nature. God bless you, and I'll see you all next time.